Week 2024. We're really pleased to have you all with us and just to see so many people on the call. Yeah, made me a bit nervous now, and probably Rebecca and Fran as well, but we'll try our best. Be nice. My name is Laura Bell. I'm an advanced practice lead occupational therapist, and that's with Adult Social Care in Cumberland. And I'll just pass you on to Rebecca now to introduce herself.
I can't get it off mute. There we go, mute button. I'm Rebecca Redmayne. I'm one of the social workers in the Westmoreland and Furness Safeguarding Adults team, and was involved with the gentleman whose story is being told today.
And I'll pass you over to Fran as well to introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everybody, my name's Fran Lyon. I am one of the specialist safeguarding practitioners with Lancashire and South Cumbria ICB, and I just want to mention that my colleague Jackie Livesey, who is also a safeguarding practitioner like me, has done loads of work on this, but unfortunately is just a little bit poorly today to join. So, but thanks Jackie, I know she's listening.
And I just also wanted to say that we are really lucky to have Rebecca here with us today. As she's mentioned, she was John's social worker in the safeguarding team at the time. And she is talking today about John really from her personal experience and reflecting on the challenges and opportunities that she faced at that time. So just a big thank you to Rebecca for being with us today and presenting. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we start properly. Yeah, so John is a real person. The pseudonym John is being used to protect his identity. We may have people attending the session today who have maybe worked with John, so just please remain respectful of others, take a break if you need to, and we are available after the session if anybody wants to have a one-to-one discussion, that's absolutely fine. We ask that you remain on mute for the duration of the session, but there will be an opportunity throughout to interact via polls and a quiz, and possibly time at the end to open up for a bit of reflection, discussion, or any kind of questions you want to ask. But please, as we go through, just add any questions or thoughts that kind of pop up into the chat box. I know Helen and Simone are keeping an eye on the chat box for us, which is great. We'll try and respond to all of those. But there's obviously there's 90 people on the call now, so we might not be able to get back to all questions during this lunch and learn session, but we will try and respond afterwards. And Cumbria Safeguarding Adults Board will be sending out the slide deck to attendees following the session, and that'll include kind of all of the references and the resources that we mention in today's session. And I know Simone mentioned it at the beginning, just as more people are coming onto the call, it's just a reminder to everybody that the session is being recorded, and it will be available on the Cumbria Safeguarding Adults Board website in the near future. And just for reference and a reminder for us, we might use abbreviations when we're talking. So, for example, we might say CSAB, which is the Cumbria Safeguarding Adults Board, or the MCA, which is the Mental Capacity Act 2005. But please let us know in the chat box if we use any abbreviations without, if we do it accidentally and we don't explain, just let us know. Okay, pass on to you, Fran. You're just on mute, Fran, I think.
That's a good start, isn't it? Sorry, everybody. So yeah, just a quick brief oversight. They're up on the screen for you all to read, but really just what we want to get through. We're conscious it's only a short session, so we're trying to keep it short and brief, but basically just to increase practitioner knowledge, understanding around self-neglect. How can we develop practitioner confidence, build your knowledge and skills in identifying and supporting people who are identified as self-neglecting, promote that professional curiosity and multi-agency working, encouraging and reflections on good practice, and then with some practical providing tools and resources to support practice as we move forward from today. Thank you. So firstly, we just wanted to do a quick caption of what is self-neglect. So the term self-neglect is commonly used by practitioners to describe widely differing behaviours and lifestyles. Until 2014, self-neglect in England was located outside of the adult safeguarding systems and procedures. So the danger here being that instead of self-neglect being seen as everybody's business, it was more likely nobody's or somebody else's business. But with the implementation of the Care Act in 2014, this was changed. So the statutory guidance to the Act included self-neglect within the list of circumstances that constituted abuse or neglect, placing it firmly within that safeguarding adult business footing. So it provided us with that real solid legislative base to work from. So potential underlying causes. So sorry, just something popped up on the screen. It's not always possible to establish a root cause for self-neglecting behaviours, but however, it can be seen as a result of, and we've just popped some on here. This isn't a complete list. You may find other things, think of other things, but just really that we need to consider when we're looking around that root cause around self-neglect. Is the trauma, our life, have the experienced adverse life experiences, grief, unmet health, social needs, the impact of physical health, the impact of mental health, neurodiversity, cognitive learning needs, whether they're diagnosed or potentially suspected, has the individual a brain injury, what's the link with hoarding disorder, is anything suggestive of hoarding disorder also present, alcohol, substance use, is there any coercion, abuse from a third party? And sometimes it's those financial pressures. We all know what's going on in the world right now, but essentially, is there an impact of finances on that's leading in that self-neglecting behaviour? But like I say, it's not an exhaustive list there. These were just some of the top ones we popped on for you to have a little think about.
We'll just kind of go through the questions anyways. So the first question is, self-neglect is usually a lifestyle choice, true or false? So the answer to that is false. So well done if you got it right. Research shows that self-neglect results from complex interaction between physical, psychological, emotional, and social factors in the person's life. Self-neglect is more often a response to trauma and adverse experiences, a coping mechanism to manage fear and to manage insecurity, which then itself produces or can produce shame, isolation, and further distress. Accepting self-neglect as a lifestyle choice and walking away without having assessed the risk and engage with the person in a real meaningful way is it's not acceptable, as this exposes the person to ongoing or increased harm or risk, and organisations to fail in their duty of care. Okay, so moving on to question 2. So the question is, self-neglect doesn't always have to be the subject of a safeguarding inquiry. True or false? So the answer to that is true. So the statutory guidance to the Care Act states that self-neglect might not always lead to a Section 42 inquiry. A decision has to be made on a case-by-case basis on whether the person is able to protect themselves by controlling their own behaviour. And this again is a reference to the belief that self-neglect is sometimes a lifestyle choice, which, as we've talked about just before, is rarely the case. Situations of high risk arising from self-neglect do need to be addressed, whether through safeguarding or through other multi-agency approaches. Okay, so question 3. If somebody neglecting has mental capacity and refuses to engage in intervention, there is nothing that can be done to impose a solution. True or false? So the answer to that one is false. So mental capacity assessment is so important and pivotal to determining interventions. If the person lacks capacity in relation to their personal care or the living conditions, the health care or the care and support, the Mental Capacity Act 2005 sets out the requirement for those decisions to be made by others acting in the person's best interests. The person's wishes, feelings, beliefs and values must always still be taken into account. If the person has been assessed as having capacity and negotiated solutions have not been possible, interventions can be looked at and imposed under other legislation relating to housing, public health, social behaviour on the grounds that the self-neglect is posing high levels of risk, detriment, nuisance or annoyance to others. In some circumstances, an application can be made to the High Court to take protective measures using its inherent jurisdiction. Okay, so question 4. We don't have time to work with people who self-neglect. We need to find quick solutions. True or false? The answer is false. So quick solutions that solve the immediate risk to health or safety that self-neglect presents can be a false time economy. So without addressing those underlying influences on the person's behaviour or establishing that relationship of trust, such solutions are likely to be followed by reoccurrence of the problem. They can also cause acute and lasting psychological distress, adding a further layer of trauma to the person's life, which obviously we don't want to do. Equally, walking away from self-neglect because of lack of time to show professional curiosity and build that relationship may result in a far greater cost if those risks remain unaddressed, even as far as a cost to the person's life. Long-term involvement is necessary because people who self-neglect are frequently and repeatedly referred to services, and the literature suggests that more concrete interventions work better if they take place against the backdrop of a trusting relationship that you've been able to form with the person. And the last question is, we can only do what the person will allow us to do. We have to respect autonomy. True or false? And the answer to that is false. So whilst we do need to respect a person's autonomy, that also has to be balanced with a duty of care. So making safeguarding personal involves really working with the person to help them develop the ability to see and to pursue different options and to live in ways that can increase participation in their own self-care and meaningful tasks, and to manage and reduce those risks that they face. Respecting autonomy does not mean abandonment. Okay, so hopefully you've done well on the quiz. Okay, so moving on. So would you recognise self-neglect in practice? I've just put some possible signs and indicators on the slide there that you might come across in your practice. So you might see a lack of self-care to an extent that it threatens personal health and safety. So for example, you might see a significant weight loss. You might see malnutrition, dehydration, some skin damage or pressure ulcers. You might see hazards in the home environment that are having a significant impact on the person's health and well-being. But despite this, the person doesn't want any help or assistance from services which could actually improve the self-care and their environment. So I think, as we all know, and which is probably why there's so many people on the call today, self-neglect is a complex and it's a challenging area of practice. And I just want you to use the chat box just to kind of note down in there what, in your experience, you've found most challenging when you've been working with a person who's experiencing self-neglect, just so we can maybe kind of collate some themes. I'm going to continue talking as you're writing those down. So self-neglect can be a complex area for intervention, as issues of capacity and that lifestyle choice that we mentioned before are often involved. And that includes individual judgments about what is an acceptable way of living and the degree of risks to self. And, not everybody, not all of us will kind of have that same view or agree on that either. Even in cases where it appears the risk to the individual may be significant, there might not actually be any clear legal ground to intervene, which again can make it challenging. Many decisions will hinge on whether the person concerned has the capacity to make an informed choice about how they are living and the risks to which they're exposed. Assessing capacity for an individual who might be resistant or suspicious of outside intervention or services, again, can be a real complex task. However, the risks to individuals can be really high, and with some cases of self-neglect leading to the person's death. So managing the balance between protecting adults from self-neglect and their right to self-determination, again, can be a real challenge. So safeguarding duties apply where the adult has care and support needs and is at risk of self-neglect, which they are unable to protect themselves from due to their own care and support needs. And the nature of that potential harm is it's often a chronic risk that originates in quite deep-rooted psychological issues. So as Fran talked about before, that could be for unresolved grief, for example. And the ability of the individual to protect themselves, controlling their own behaviour, will be a major influence on the pathway to intervention. And there may be a point where the individual, they have been able to do that, but for whatever reason, whether it's cognitive, physical deterioration, they might then be unable to do this without that external support. I've just popped a little picture on that slide there. And that is a tool from Research in Practice called Working with People Who Self-Neglect, a practice tool. It's the tool really it's really good. I've used it in practice and I've found it really beneficial. And I like it because it's practical. So it helps you really think about how to initially engage with people who self-neglect, what conversations you need to have, what approach you might need to take, and what kind of real factual information you need to find out in order to get a good understanding of their situation and their perspective. It advises on some practical approaches that have proved useful to practitioners. It's got a case study in there with reflective questions designed to support your thinking and your decision making, and then you can then kind of take and apply that to your own practice if you're working with somebody who's self-neglecting. And it also includes like a really useful like a checklist of potential interventions to consider. Obviously you're kind of led by the person and what's meaningful to the person, but a list to go through of potential interventions to consider and the benefits and drawbacks of these. As I say, it's a real practical tool to use, and you can use it. You could use it in your supervision, whether that's one-to-one supervision or peer supervision, or you could use it, with a colleague as well. So again, that resource will be, I don't know if it's going to be put in the chat, but it will be shared wider after the session.
Okay, so let's get to John's story, and I'm pleased to say it is a good news story. We often focus all our learning, don't we, from where things haven't gone quite so well. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Rebecca, and in where there's been it's a good news story. So it was first presented to Cumbria Safeguarding Adult Board, where it was agreed that the story would be shared with practitioners across the system as this excellent example to learn from. It highlights how, when things go right, how professionals work together, build effective relationships, and whilst dealing with all those challenges. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca there.
Wonderful. So at the time of our involvement under Safeguarding Adults processes, John was a gentleman who was in his early 70s. He lived alone with his dog in an extremely isolated old workers' cottage in Cumbria, and this cottage had no direct access for vehicles, so it's quite difficult to access him at times. John paid what we referred to as a peppercorn rent to a private landlord he had no contact with. And although the property was rented, John considered that property as belonging to him for the rest of his life. That was the agreement he'd come to with that landlord. John expressed a very deeply held wish to remain in this property until the day he died. He'd been born there. He'd lived there most of his life, aside from a few periods of time where he'd gone away for work. John didn't have any contact with his family anymore. However, he did have a friend still in the nearby village who provided him with some help and support at times. And we were told that until very recently, John had lived a very independent life, but not much was really known about his lifestyle and history. John had unstable diabetes, and there was some evidence that he possibly had some mild cognitive issues at the time as well, but at that point there was no diagnosis. John had managed to live independently for many years, driving to his GP surgery every day for support with his insulin from the practice nurses. But he'd recently lost his driving licence due to his poor eyesight, which resulted from his diabetes. And so the district nursing team had started to visit him at home to administer his insulin, as he couldn't get to the GP surgery anymore. When those visits started, the district nursing team found that John's home was in extremely poor condition. There was no heating or hot water. At the time of their involvement, it was winter, and it was a very cold winter. The property was very cold, and the temperatures even within the property were consistently below freezing. The district nurses found that the electrics were unsafe, that John didn't appear to have a working fridge or oven, although we did actually work out later that it was so cold in the property the fridge wouldn't work because it was warmer in the fridge than in the property. And during visits, district nurses felt that it didn't appear to have sufficient food, and he found that the food that he did have was often spoiled or out of date. John did not agree that his living conditions were poor. He insisted that he was managing within his home and that he wasn't at risk. He said his friend was helping him with shopping and that he preferred to eat meals out rather than at home. He acknowledged that he needed help with his insulin, but his view was that this was only because he was no longer able to get to the GP surgery himself. John expressed very strongly at every single stage that it was of utmost importance to him to remain in his own property. Are we moving on to the next slide? Yep. So unfortunately, although John was insistent that he was managing and that he was safe and independent at home, he was regularly found to be hypothermic and with low blood sugars when the district nurses visited. And there were concerns that he did not understand the risk of serious harm or death to him if he didn't manage his diabetes and keep himself warm and well fed. So as a result of those concerns, John's GP and the district nurses raised a safeguarding concern with adult social care due to their feeling that there was a high risk of harm or death in relation to John's self-neglect. On occasions, John could become verbally aggressive when it was suggested that his home was no longer suitable for him to live in. John often expressed threats of self-harm and harm to his property if he was no longer able to live there. For example, he'd threatened to burn it down with him in it. The professionals involved were concerned and felt that he absolutely was capable of carrying out such threats. So the professionals were concerned that not only did John not seem to recognise when he was becoming unwell, that he also didn't really seem to care, stating that if he died, then so be it. Although John did not agree that he was at risk of harm, he did accept support from the district nursing team and adult social care with food packages and coal for heating. However, he was not accepting of additional support and did not agree that his home was unsafe for him to live in. John was made aware that the safeguarding process had been started, but didn't wish to engage with this, although he was happy to continue to have visits from professionals over the winter period to check his well-being. In his absence at the safeguarding meetings, John agreed that an advocate could represent him and his views during safeguarding meetings, and that advocate met with John on a number of occasions to gather his views and engage with him around that process. The safeguarding risk assessments did also consider the ways in which John was managing to keep himself safe, as well as the risks. For example, we knew that he had a mobile phone and he was able to use this, although he never did use it to contact professionals. He would answer it to his friend and ring her when he wanted to. And although John could be unenthusiastic about district nurse visits and at times quite verbally aggressive towards them, he did allow them to take his blood sugars and administer his insulin when they arrived at the property each day. And John was actually quite receptive to the support from adult social care and from the environmental health team, and would allow social workers in to see him and to bring him food packages and coal for the fire. Although he was not accepting of any formal support like a care package or anything like that, he had not completely disengaged from professionals supporting him. A sensitive approach from environmental health officers was also received quite positively by John. So there were some positives there as well in all of the concerns that the professionals had. Moving on to the next slide, if we haven't already. Yep. So as the safeguarding risk assessments progressed, different professionals involved held different opinions in respect of John's capacity to understand the risks. And it really did appear that his capacity did fluctuate depending on how well he was at the time and also what he was being spoken to about. And it was ultimately agreed that whilst John had capacity to make unwise decisions in parts of his life, such as around his accommodation, it was agreed that he was felt to lack capacity in relation to managing his health and his nutritional needs. As a result of this required professionals involved to assess risks as they occurred and ensure communication within the multidisciplinary team. We all kept in communication with each other around how well he was at that time, what he was wanting to happen at that time, and whether or not one person had been allowed in, but perhaps someone else hadn't been. This did present challenges to professionals, as at times John's situation was really quite high risk, and there was a lot of people who were very concerned that he was really at risk in the cold weather and not necessarily understanding all of those risks all of the time. However, as time progressed, it was eventually Environmental Health who took action and advised John that they had no choice but to take enforcement action under the Housing Act 2004 against the landlord of the property because they considered the property no longer fit for habitation. So as a result, John himself was served with a prohibition order and he was advised that he would need to move out of the property or face court action himself. Further to this information, John, to the surprise of pretty much everyone involved, accepted that he could no longer live safely in his home and agreed that he would move with his dog into sheltered accommodation in the nearby village, which was close to his friend. It was felt that the relationships by the environmental health team, adult social care and the health professionals that we'd all built with John over a period of quite a few months had been key in John finally accepting that his situation needed to change. There were benefits to John living in the village and he was able to resume visiting the GP surgery daily for his diabetes management and support and doing that independently. And John was able to source his own food more independently from the local shops and from the cafe. Following his move, John actually told one of the social workers who had been involved with him that his new home was a palace. He said, "It's a lot better than where I was. I liked it up there, but don't get me wrong, I couldn't get anything done. This is much better." John also reported that he was glad that he'd moved and that he'd already found some nice places to walk his dog. After that, John continued to be supported in the community, having his care needs met locally and living in his new home, which was warm and safe, whilst still maintaining some independence and autonomy. John's story demonstrates persistence and coordination of support from adult social care and the district nursing team, who supported him with food and cold deliveries over the winter months. In doing so, we significantly reduced the risks to John and developed a positive relationship with him that eventually supported his decision to move when he was required to do so. It was recognised by everyone that John's home was of great importance to him, and this was always considered by professionals in their interactions with him. John's right to make unwise decisions as a capacitated adult in relation to his living accommodation was understood and respected. But the risks from his lack of capacity in relation to his health and nutritional needs were mitigated by professionals as far as possible, while still maintaining his human rights and wishes in the other aspects of his life. So although it wasn't necessarily what John had wanted to have moved out of that property, those relationships that we built with him eventually managed to resolve the situation to everyone's satisfaction. And John has lived quite well there for some time since, although unfortunately I believe he is quite poorly now and in hospital, but unrelated to the self-neglect concerns.
Thanks, Rebecca. So it's just to really highlight the multi-agency involvement and a real consistent approach from all agencies in John's story. That's a real positive to highlight that Rebecca's kind of already highlighted really well. You know, the safeguarding meetings brought together all of the professionals involved with John's care, and that was across health and social care, and also included, as Rebecca mentioned, environmental health, who attended John's home due to concerns for his safety. And I just wanted to mention here about the Care Act including a duty of cooperation. So that makes, you know, integration, cooperation and partnership a legal requirement on local authorities and on all agencies involved in public care. So this includes but isn't limited to the NHS, independent or private sector organisations, housing and the police. And that cooperation with partners should enable earlier intervention, you know, which is the best way to prevent, reduce or delay needs for care and support and safeguard adults at risk from abuse or neglect. Okay, so what went well? So yeah, John was always kept at the heart of decisions during the safeguarding process. His voice was heard both directly and through advocacy. So I think it's an important point to highlight that John was made aware that a safeguarding concern had been raised. So from the GP and the nurse, the district nurse, and the reasons for this were discussed with him. You know, so there was open and honest communication with John from the beginning, you know, which is, you know, in line and demonstrates those safeguarding principles of empowerment and accountability. John didn't consent to the safeguarding concern. As Rebecca said, he didn't agree with the perceived level of risk being presented to him by others. However, the referral was still made and it was justified as there was a vital risk to John's health and safety. And there were also concerns regarding his capacity to understand how his behaviour and the way that he was living was putting his life at risk. And as Rebecca mentioned, John didn't really want to be involved directly in the safeguarding meetings. He did consent to a referral for an advocate, which was really positive. So advocacy is an important tool to ensure people are listened to and they have the rights and the choices respected. Advocates work alongside individuals and are on that person's side. So there are different types of advocacy, but they all follow the same key principles. So independence, empowerment, equality and accessibility. And advocacy is a real kind of important factor to consider because it helps individuals understand what is happening, helps them to access services and challenge things when things maybe don't go the way they want them to. So the NHS and the local authority have a duty to appoint a Care Act advocate if a person is subject to a safeguarding inquiry or review and that they have substantial difficulty engaging in that process and no family or friends who are appropriate to support the person to engage, which is, the route that Rebecca took with John. So in Cumbria, advocacy is provided by People First, that's in Cumberland, and in Westmoreland and Furness, it's provided by Encompass. And at the end of the slide deck, we've put a link to the website for more information together with the online referral forms. And there's also a really useful quick guide to advocacy on the Cumbria Safeguarding Adults Board Learning Zone section. Yeah, so a network of health and social care professionals really work together well under the safeguarding process to facilitate John to remain at home as safely as possible through those winter months by ensuring his heating, nutritional and medication needs were being met adequately. And the Care and Support Statutory Guidance specifically refers to the need to work alongside people who self-neglect to really understand how their past experiences influence the current behaviours. And the duty to promote well-being applies equally to those who, for a variety of reasons, may be difficult to engage, which John was one of those people. But despite that, Rebecca and the other professionals have really worked alongside him, kind of especially over those winter months. I just think it really highlights that well-being principle. So the multi-agency response to concerns of John's risk to life because of the self-neglect was appropriately shared out and managed and the risk reduced as a direct outcome of the safeguarding process. All agencies involved participated in the safeguarding risk assessment, including the GP. The risk assessment was reviewed and it was updated regularly during at least 5 multi-agency meetings, and the risk assessments was shared with all agencies as well. And as Rebecca mentioned about environmental health, the referral to environmental health was made as part of the safeguarding process. So the Environmental Health Department within the local authority, they do have powers and duties to deal with hazards and address concerns within the physical environment, and they are key contributors to the safeguarding risk assessment and process. So the Housing Act 2004 that Rebecca mentioned allows enforcement action where either a Category 1 or Category 2 hazard has been identified and exists in a building, posing a risk of harm to the health or safety of an actual occupier. And the powers kind of range from serving an improvement notice, taking emergency remedial action, to the making of a demolition order. And in John's case, as Rebecca said, there was a prohibition order to close the whole of the dwelling. So even though, the law was used to force change in the end for John, professionals took every opportunity to engage and involve John and support his control and participation throughout that. John had no neighbours, he had no external people that would have picked up on those environmental hazards and the safety issues within his home. It's the safeguarding referral and that process that created this awareness. And the enforcement officer from the environmental health team had a really good rapport and relationship with John. They were honest with him, they built trust, and they visited John with the social worker multiple times, which was a fantastic approach. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. You go, Fran.
Yeah, sorry. So just I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try to be brief. But I mean, Rebecca's covers most of this really around how important that Mental Capacity Act assessment was at every stage, and by varying agencies within the multi-agency team. So it was very much recognising those time-specific, decision-specific assessments that were needed, and how they were communicated to each other, how that helped to support professionals in carrying that risk, in developing those safeguarding risk assessment plans, keeping each other fully informed. But what it really evidenced was that sort of nuance around where health may say he doesn't have capacity around his managing his health in the case of his diabetes, so potentially being hypothermic. If he doesn't have food, how does that impact on his diabetes, his understanding around that. Whereas the local authority may say, well, he's got capacity to choose around his living conditions and everything else. So you can see how that sort of interface between the two, you may have those challenges arising, and it's how do you manage those professionally and in that agreement, and keeping John at the heart of that. So yeah, it was just really just to evidence that the sort of real key element of managing those mental capacity assessments at all stages, revisiting, reviewing and sharing that information to make sure the team's fully up to speed. And wrapping around John.
So just to quickly recap, when is self-neglecting a safeguarding issue? So I've put kind of the information there on the slide for you to read, but how you respond to self-neglect and the approach that you take will depend on the level of risk or harm that has been identified, and whether the adult is then able to protect themselves by controlling their own behaviour. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and the need for a safeguarding inquiry should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. I just wanted to mention the Safeguarding Adults Threshold tool, which a lot of you have probably seen and used in practice. But that tool is there to support practitioners, partners and providers, working within the adult sector to report and respond to concerns at the appropriate level, and just to kind of have that consistency of approach across agencies. You can use the tool in your supervision or in discussion with other professionals if you're concerned about somebody, to talk kind of through the person's situation and the level of risk, and to support your own decision making. So the threshold tool is an aid. It's not a tick box approach. And professional curiosity, making safeguarding personal, and more digging is often needed to kind of make an evidence-based decision. And it's important to use the safeguarding threshold tool alongside the CSAB Safeguarding Adult Self-Neglect Guidance 2021 document as well. And then just quickly, how to respond to self-neglect cases, which I've already heard John's excellent example. But obviously, working with adults with complex care and support needs, and where the challenge of engagement exists, it can prove to be time consuming and stressful for everybody concerned. However, failure to engage with people who aren't looking after themselves, whether they've got mental capacity or not, might have serious implications for the person's health and well-being. I think it's really important to think about the root cause. You might not be able to identify that, but it might be possible to identify underlying causes that might help address the issue. You'll need to make referrals to specialist health teams or mental health teams for more comprehensive assessments of the person's mental and physical health. And those assessments might then provide access to therapy, whether that's occupational therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, education and rehabilitation, to support the person identify, the positive behaviours, strengths and skills to support their own self-care and regain some control and independence. Consider whether the person has the necessary information in a format they can understand, and adapt that if you need to. So think about all the reasonable adjustments you need to make to support the person in making their own decisions. And if they're unable to make that specific decision, even with the reasonable adjustments you've put in place, how are you making sure that you really know what the wishes, feelings and beliefs are in relation to that decision? You're checking whether the person can understand their options and the consequences of the choices. Just really making sure that you ask about and listen to the reasons for mistrust or refusal. ensuring there's enough time to have those conversations, build a relationship of trust, and use a long-term approach, and just try and agree on small goals. And offer and complete a care act assessment as well to ascertain care and support needs, reablement goals and support as well as home care.
We just wanted to pop a little bit on though, just to sort of reflect about how prevalent the sort of considerations around self-neglect are. So the National Strategic Adult Review Analysis, that was from April 17 to March 19, and then there was a second one 19 to 23. In this report, they picked up that of the 652 safeguarding adult reviews that were focused in this review sample, 60% of those featured self-neglect, which is obviously a considerable amount. And it was that self-neglect was the most frequent type of abuse or neglect reviewed. So it's just to demonstrate, I guess, that when we're dealing with self-neglect, it's very, very complex. You can understand why quite often that might lead to those safeguarding adult reviews because of the challenges that practitioners face. But just that's why we're so keen to have brought that to you today.